142,258 killed soldiers of the Russian occupation army. That's the number confirmed by independent researchers as of early November. In the past 2 weeks, nearly 5,000 new deaths have been added to the list, double the usual rate. These data were presented by Mediazona and the BBC Russian service. Researchers note that the increase is not due to a change in the situation at the front, but to clarification of data on those listed as missing. These figures are just the tip of the iceberg. The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine reports that the total losses of the Russian army, including killed and wounded, have already reached 1,148,910. The discrepancy between the official and independent figures is easily explained. The Kremlin is concealing the scale of the disaster and doing everything possible to prevent Russians from knowing exactly how many of their fellow citizens have perished in Ukrainian fields. A particularly alarming trend in recent months is the involvement of minors. According to Russian journalists, more and more teenagers are volunteering for the front, often immediately after turning 18. Russian authorities have consistently rewritten laws to expand the scope for such recruitment. As a result, young men who have barely finished school are now being sent to war. Their paths are the same. From signing a contract to death, only 1 or 2 months pass. Young Russians, swayed by promises of easy money and glory, end up on the front lines and die under fire from Ukrainian drones and artillery. For the Kremlin, they are expendable, cheap bodies to replenish the assault squads. Russian propaganda calls them heroes, but in reality, they are children being thrown into the meat grinder by the authorities to continue their aggression. While Moscow promises victory at any cost, the price is being paid by Russians themselves, with their lives and the future of their children. The British Ministry of Defense says more than 1 million Russian soldiers have been killed or wounded in wartime, a toll that is impossible to independently verify, given that Russia keeps these statistics secret, but is consistent with other estimates by Western intelligence agencies and think tanks. But according to Oleg Ignatov, senior Russian analyst at Crisis Group, one reason behind Russia's swelling number of troops is that it is now suffering fewer losses. This is explained by a change in tactics, he told. Russia has almost stopped using heavy equipment on the battlefield because it is highly vulnerable to drones. The last time Russia used heavy equipment on a large scale was during the Kursk operation in winter, he added, referring to Ukraine's counterattack in western Russia. Russia has not attacked with large groups of soldiers for a long time. Russia uses small groups, sometimes 1 or 2 people, to gradually infiltrate Ukrainian army positions under the cover of drones and artillery. This reduces casualties. In the first year of the war, thousands of young men eligible for military service fled towards neighboring countries such as Georgia and Mongolia. Police patrolled subways and raided accommodation housing migrants to round up potential draftees. These fears of being press-ganged have now largely dissipated. In reality, since November 1st, 2022, there is no call-up for mobilization, said a human rights lawyer from Appeal to Conscience, a collective that helps eligible recruits avoid military service. At the same time, the mobilization period is ongoing and has not been lifted. That is, those who are mobilized and already serving cannot quit until the end of mobilization. Since 2022, instead of conscripting for mobilization, the regions have been given the task of recruiting contract soldiers. Only those recruited under contract can participate in the war. The lawyer added that the confusion is exploited by unscrupulous recruiters who tell their targets that, since conscription is still in place, they are obliged to sign a contract. There have been cases where conscripts have had contracts signed on their behalf, which is illegal in Russia. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has been accused by Kremlin officials of sabotage after his conversation with U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio disrupted a planned meeting between Russian dictator Vladimir Putin and U.S. President Donald Trump in Budapest. The Russian Telegram channel Nezigar reported this, citing sources. According to them, after the summit was cancelled, Putin had a serious conversation with Lavrov, and some officials believe the minister committed sabotage. Lavrov is clearly depressed right now. He's found himself at the epicenter of intrigue. The channel quotes one of its sources as saying, according to the source, many are now convinced that Lavrov is following in the footsteps of Sergei Shoigu, who lost his post as head of the Russian Ministry of Defense last May. The interlocutor adds that Lavrov has lost the favor of the head of the Kremlin regime and now appears as a weak element. Meanwhile, the foreign ministry of the aggressor country is now forced to make public leaks, proving its innocence in the disruption of the meeting between Putin and Trump. The channel writes that Lavrov, taking a tough stance in his conversation with Rubio, thought he was expressing Putin's position, but this allegedly turned out to be wrong. But Lavrov managed to discredit the Dmitriev-Witkoff communication channel in the eyes of Rubio and Trump, the report said. The subsequent urgent visit by Kremlin's special envoy Kirill Dmitriev to Washington proved a failure and did not help rectify the situation. Following the diplomatic failure with the United States, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov fell out of favor with Putin for the first time in years. He was suspended from key meetings and delegations in the Kremlin, according to Russian media. The 76-year-old minister, considered the Kremlin's main voice abroad for decades, suddenly disappeared from view. He failed to appear at a Security Council meeting and lost his status as head of the G20 delegation. Western publications describe the state of the Russian foreign minister as anger, intransigence, and stubbornness. Russian media reports, after an unsuccessful conversation with U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, which led to the cancellation of the planned Putin-Trump summit, Lavrov suddenly disappeared from all official events. Lavrov was absent from the meeting of the Russian Security Council, where Putin instructed it to consider the resumption of nuclear testing. He was the only permanent member of the Security Council absent from the meeting. The White House recently stated that Lavrov is clearly tired. The Kremlin then dealt another blow. Lavrov was stripped of his position as head of the Russian delegation to the G20 summit. His place will be taken by a young economics official, Maxim Oreshkin, clearly closer to Putin's current circle. This decision by the Kremlin looks like a demonstrative surrender of an old warrior. Lavrov, long a symbol of Putin's diplomacy, has become an inconvenient figure, too old, too predictable, and too closely linked to foreign policy failures. Diplomatic circles say the failure of the talks with the US was the final straw. Lavrov tried to convince the Americans of the need for a meeting between Putin and Trump in Budapest, but the conversation ended with a firm refusal and new sanctions against Rosneft and Lukoil.